Should Christians send their children to public schools? What is the best way to go? Public school, private school, or homeschool? On this slice of fresh bread. Welcome to Fresh Bread, a podcast ministry of Grace Bible Church, Gainesville. Pastor Brandon, Pastor Keith. Well, hi, everyone. Thanks for clicking on Fresh Bread, podcast 34. Fresh Bread, where we're bringing the truth of God's Word to a starving world. I'm Pastor Keith, he's Pastor Brandon, and today we're going to talk about children and public schools. So, Pastor Brandon, are you ready?
Sure. Let's do it.
I'm going to ask the first question, the big one right off the bat. Should Christians send their children off to public schools?
Well, that's probably a nuanced answer. I don't know if in all cases we can avoid public school. Right? Just as universities, in terms of, becoming a doctor, becoming a lawyer, becoming an engineer, a scientist, any of those STEM degrees, a lot of them are going to require public school education. When we say public school, let's be clear, we're not necessarily talking about just publicly funded schools. We're also talking about private schools that are non-Christian, I think is what you're referring to. And so even sending your children to a university that's private, non-Christian, in terms of getting a STEM degree or a degree there, is that something that we should do? And, the question again is nuanced, because I think for us to have a complete exit out of those spheres would be problematic because of the degrees that are required. You can't, it's hard to get a Christian education in civil engineering. I'm a civil engineer by trade, so that's comes to my mind, but I would have a very difficult time getting a truly Christian education as a civil engineer. As a doctor or as a lawyer, I would have a difficult time getting those degrees in terms of fully Christian education. And so I don't think that we can have this complete exit out of the public sphere in terms of that because of that. Now, in terms of younger children, I would say that you need to be very careful in sending your children to public school. I'm not ready to say that a Christian shouldn't send their kids to public school, because there are still pockets of public schools that are not as far gone as some of the others. I mean, there are pockets. Like I say, it's a nuanced answer. I'm not totally anti-public school, but I think it's something that you have to be very careful with.
So do you think that even Christian should teach in a public school?
Well, I would come nearer saying that a Christian should teach in a public school more than I would say that we should send our kids to public schools, because at the end of the day, I mean, that person's going to have a huge impact, potential huge impact on multiple children, in terms of that for that time. And so if they feel like that they can do it, if they feel like it's something that it's a ministry for them and they can do that, then yes, I think that they should. My daughter actually is trying to decide. She's in her last year of her education, getting ready to be an elementary school teacher, and she's trying to decide what she's going to do. And she has talked about teaching in a public school. And so we'll see if she does that. I do think that someone doing that needs to see it as a ministry. I do think they need to see it as an outreach. Now, obviously, in the public school, you're going to be limited in terms of the things that you can say and at least publicly and outwardly, but you still have opportunities on an individual basis to speak truth into these kids' lives at a very formative time.
So what I'm thinking of is the LGBTQ thing. They really push that, and as a believer, it's hard. Like, how would you opt out of that? You would be ostracized and maybe even lose your job.
Well, I think you have to make that stand. I mean, I don't think you can go down that road, and if you lose your job, so be it.
Okay.
But at least you've made that stand. If there are places that administration that is more Christian leaning in terms of where they're at, depending on whether they have a Christian background or whatever, or whether they're, I guess ultimately Christians. But yes, my experience has been that there are places that aren't as difficult as other places, and then there are other places that with administration they've gotten involved in, and it's way beyond what we can bear in terms of what in terms of Christians.
Do you think it's really a myth that public schools are a neutral learning place?
Oh, absolutely a myth.
Okay.
There's no way it's neutral. Because everybody has a worldview. Every school, I think it depends on who's in charge. It depends on the administration and what they're allowing, and it comes down to what's happening in the classroom. And but every teacher in that location, in those places, have a worldview. They're going to be pushing that worldview, and so if their worldview is evolutionary and anti-God, then they're going to push that worldview. If their worldview is pro LGBTQ plus the all the alphabet thing that they've got going on, that's the worldview they're gonna push. If it's a woke Black Lives Matter type of idea that's pushing the agenda, that's what they're gonna do. And so I think that it is an absolute myth to think that there's a neutral learning place. Let's face it, if Grace Bible Church had a Christian school, it wouldn't be a neutral learning place. And we have a worldview. It's a Christian worldview. It's a biblical worldview, and we're going to push that worldview. And if someone puts their child in our school, if we had hypothetically, if we had a school, if someone would put their child in that school, we would push our worldview, and we wouldn't be apologetic about it. And so I get it that public schools kind of have this idea of being neutral in that way, but I don't see it that way at all.
Yeah, you and I have been around a few years. So how anti-God do you think public schools have become, let's say even the last 10 years?
No, I don't think you can say every school board, every school administration, I don't think you can say in every place that's happened. If you think about it, back in the late 70s, Jimmy Carter started the Department of Education. Why did they start the Department of Education? Because they're funding schools. If they have the Department of Education, if they're funding schools, then they're going to be able to dictate what's being taught in the schools because of the money. And if schools get out of step with what the Department of Education says that they should do, there's not going to be the funding. And so the pressure from the federal government is to teach and do what the federal government says. And so we can look at the federal government and we can see the corruption that's there. It doesn't matter what side of the aisle that you're on. You see corruption. That's what's controlling our public school system. It's being controlled from Washington, from the Department of Education, because the money is flowing from there and to the states. The states are pushing that money down, and there's a pressure to do what's being told the federal government wants them to do. Well, all we have to do is look at the federal government and see what the federal government's struggling with, and that's exactly what's being pushed into our schools. So it doesn't take much deduction to say that they're definitely in the past 30 to 40 years, there's been there's been this slide downward. I think I've told the story even on Fresh Bread, but maybe I've just told it to you, Keith. But I had a fourth grade teacher who retired right after our class went through, and she just said, "Look, I see that this is getting off the rails," and that was a fourth grade teacher. We're talking many years ago. And she's already seeing it get off the rails at that point, and it's even gone even more so. And I don't know. I was too young. I'm not able to obviously go back and talk to her at this point. But exactly what made her say that. But she was seeing something even at that point that was pointing toward it getting worse, and that was 40 years ago.
Hopefully, it wasn't you in her class.
Well, I was pretty bad. I was pretty bad.
I can't imagine that.
Yeah, I was little known fact. I was spanked every day.
Oh my word!
Yeah, when I was I was a little terror. Kindergarten, every day I was spanked in school. Yeah.
Boy, we come a long way since that. Wow.
I was a mess, but
yeah, we won't even go into me.
I bet you weren't spanked every day.
Not every day. But I did one time have to go to the principal's office, and he did spank me.
One time?
Yep, one time.
Wow. That's a world I don't even identify with.
And you grew up in Arkansas?
Yes.
Wow, different world.
I was even spanked in front of the class one time.
Oh my goodness, with a
paddle. Yeah, that was One of my teachers brought me up in front of the class, bent me over the desk, and spanked me right there in front of the class. It was pretty bad.
Well, some things
Can't
are
do that anymore.
better left in the past, but it used to be that when you went to school, they were teaching you how to learn, right? They were kind of giving you the basics. This is how you go about it. So it used to be this is how you think, and now it's this is what you need to think. I guess you could call it indoctrinating them with things that, as Bible believers, it goes against what we believe, right? We're talking about evolution, LGBTQ, all that stuff, and bullying, all these things that they're teaching. The other things, what I'm trying to say is like English and math and all that stuff is kind of secondary now to this other stuff.
Sure. I mean, that's it. I think that there has been a focus. The focus has moved away from, the 3 R's: reading, writing, and arithmetic. That's a joke.
Well, doesn't arithmetic begin with an R?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the focus has moved away from those as being the core, in terms of what we need to do with getting kids ready, to now there needs to be a worldview that's being indoctrinated into our thinking, and that's been going on for a long time. I mean, I think that to a lower level, it was going on even when we were in school. I mean, you think about even history. I mean, there has to be a worldview that drives that, and there's going to be a worldview. It's very difficult to teach a neutral history. And it can be done. I'm not saying you can't, but it's very difficult because there's always going to be a point of view that you're teaching from. And if you think about a biblical worldview says there's right and there's wrong. And so I can teach from a right or wrong perspective. And so if somebody did something wrong, it's wrong. If something did something right, it's right. And obviously there's nuances and choices that are made, that we have to make, and we have to try to understand, in a fallen world. But I think today there seems to be more of we're going to push a worldview that fits, more the woke, the idea of, these ideas that are out there, especially in the past few years, and that's been accelerated because it's really a backlash against what's been taught, for when you and I were growing up. There's definitely this push to minimize the country, the United States, and to tear down the country and to make us look like we're the bad guys.
Is it true that children, like adults, that bad company corrupts good character? So if we send our Christian kids to school, can they become corrupt?
Okay, so I don't take what people say is you need to send your children to public school in order to expose them socially. I don't take that to be the case. I think we can have children who are well adjusted without sending them into a place like a public school, where I don't think we have to send our kids to the wolves to toughen them up, so to speak. Having said that, I do think that we need to be very careful to get our kids ready for the world, to be exposed to the world. I don't think that we can completely insulate them forever. I do think that there is a time responsibility that we have to isolate our children and insulate our children from those kind of things as we help develop their character. That as we help inform their character, as we teach them biblically, as we teach them the right worldview, I think that we have to, love them and nurture them in that way. And I don't think that we have to expose them, early to the world in order for them to be socially adjusted. But at the same time, I don't think that it's a situation that we don't need to see it as if we can completely always isolate our children. At some point in their lifetime, they're going to be exposed to the world. We need to get them ready for that. And I'm not saying, we need to teach them, the bad things of the world. I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is that we need to teach them, and we need to get them ready for that. We need to strengthen them. And the problem with overprotection is that they're not ready for that exposure when it comes. And so we need to help them get ready for that. I'm not telling you I have the perfect process for that. It's a situation that every parent is going to have to go through and try to understand their own children and make decisions that and help them in the way that they feel is best biblically. And every child is different, every family is different, every situation is different. But at the same time, I think the main thing is to recognize that they need that solid foundation. They need that strong foundation that's biblical. They need a strong family. They need parents, a mother and a father who love them and build that relationship with them, so that when that happens, when that transition happens, and when they're more exposed to the world, they're not just going to go headlong into the world. If we are draconian and we isolate our children to the point where as soon as they find the sweetness of the world, then if we're not careful and if we're not thoughtful and wise on how we handle this, then many children go headlong into the world. And so we have to be careful in any direction we go. And so I can't, like I say, I can't tell you that I have the perfect prescription for how to do that. I don't. I mean, it's one of those things that's been more trial and error for us for me as a father and us as a family. But I do know this, the one thing that has worked and that I stand on is that my children know that I love them. My children know where I stand. And my children have this strong family. There's a strong family dynamic that they don't want to disengage from. Because of that strong dynamic, because of the foundation they've been given, the biblical foundation they've been given, because of the love that we've had for our children, as they've been more exposed to the world, as they've grown up, my children are all over 18 or older now. As they've grown up, there's been less of the world has less of an impact on them because they have that foundation. Now, that doesn't mean that they haven't struggled. So you ask, does that bad company corrupts good character? Absolutely. But we need to teach our children that. We need to, we need to teach our children biblical wisdom. And so biblical wisdom says, if I run around with bad company, that's who I'm going to be. And so, you need to be running with the right people. And we need to teach our children that as they have those choices, as they begin to be exposed to those opportunities one way or the other.
So can the opposite be true then, that if we send our kids to public schools and they are surrounded by kids with bad character, maybe it helps them understand their faith and strengthens their faith then?
Well, I think there's a time. I think my personal opinion is that there's a time when it's too early for that. I mean, I certainly would not want to send my 5-year-old and say, yeah, well, we want them to, we want them to be able to make their own decisions. No, I'm going to protect my 5-year-old. And, and our choices in terms of school reflect that. We, as a family, we homeschooled early on. Well, we did a combination of homeschool, private school for most of my children's education. The bulk of it was either homeschool or private school. We've done some public school. My youngest daughter, as an example, right now is in public school, although she is dual enrolling, and so she's not on the high school campus. And so, but early on, we did homeschooling. We started out early homeschooling, and we sent some of our kids to private. Actually, all of our kids went to private school at one time or the other. 3 of the 4 have been in public school for some stint, depending on their situation. So we've done all 4. It all depends on where we're at. It depends on what the goal is at that time. And so, yeah. But at the core of it is a strong family dynamic that with a biblical foundation that teaches our children to love the Lord, to love one another, and teaches our children ultimately the Lord made this earth and that we are accountable to Him.
As we look at the American public schools, this is what I've heard, are the worst in all the other industrialized nations. So would that be a factor? Or is it you get out what you put in? So if you're a good student, you're going to do well anyway.
Well, I think that I don't know. I mean, I think the statistics would bear out that the American public schools are probably some of the worst in the industrialized nation in terms of, I know, for sure we're behind, a place like Japan. Now, I'm certain of that, but I can't say how we compare to, England or how we compare to different nations. But it's pretty clear based on what I've read that we do rank very low in a lot of the rankings. But at the same time, what you just said, there are definitely pockets where, there's good schools and there's good that's there. And so I would say there's pockets where people, and the truth is that, look, if someone is dedicated, if they're smart, dedicated, and have a good work ethic and have a family behind them that's pushing them, or someone pushing them to do better, even in our public schools, someone can come out and do very well. I mean, it's not like there's no chance at all. I mean, I grew up. I think you came through the public school system. I came through the public school system. I would like to think that I wasn't. I mean, when I came, it's funny because when I came, I went to a small public school, very very small public school, that ranked one of the lowest ranking schools in Arkansas, which if you look at is lowest ranking states in the nation, which if you take that further, and if it is true that our nation is one of the lowest ranking and among the industrialized nations, then I came from a school that was the lowest of the low, among industrialized nations. I mean, there's no doubt that that's the case. And yet I was able to make it and able to do okay. I became an engineer now. I'm, trained as a pastor. I mean, it's possible. It's possible, but it just depends on, there's a lot of factors that go into that. So,
Yeah. And in seminary, you were Phi Beta Kappa, right?
What?
So
let's just say that I graduated too.
Actually, I went to public school until 10th grade, and then I went to private.
Okay.
But the private schools kept trying to get me out as best they could, and they couldn't do it. So I just went for sports, and that was, anyway, my story is a whole nother can of worms. But how important is it that education be Bible-centered and God-centered, do you think?
Well, I think it's incredibly important. I mean, I think that's the basis of a good education in reality. And I know that's going to be controversial and with the world. That is controversial with the world. And it may even be controversial in the church. It shouldn't be, but I think a good education is Bible-centered and is God-centered. And, because I think God is in terms of education, I think that the more we know about God and who he is, the more educated we are and are going to be in a lot of different ways. And, the more curious we're going to be about God and his creation. And, I think that if we're curious about God and his creation, that's going to lead us in directions in terms of education. We're going to be readers. We're going to read. When you think about education, the most important thing is that you get the basics. But I think the other important thing is that you open up you make the child curious. If the child is curious and can read and has the tools to do the work, the basic tools to do the work, they're going to go in a direction. And if they understand who God is, it's going to be a good direction. And I think that's the basis. Yes, I think that's the basis for a good education. Now that doesn't, again, going back, that doesn't mean that, look, Stephen Hawking was I'm sure a brilliant man, and I'm sure, but he was also a fool. It doesn't matter how brilliant you are. It doesn't matter how quote unquote educated you are. If you're a fool, you're a fool. And so it is important that we're not foolish. And I think that part of a good education is learning not to be foolish. It's learning to be wise according to what God's word says. Mm-hmm. And so, that's where we get wisdom, is from the Bible, biblical wisdom. And if we're a fool, we're a fool. And I think that's, a fool says in his heart, there is no God. So, yeah. So that's my answer, and I'm sticking to it.
Okay.
There needs to be a Bible-centered, God-centered foundation that's laid. But I think what we have to come to grips with is that, like I started out with, you've got to I mean, in terms of some of these STEM degrees, and we need them. We need STEM degrees, and as Christians, we need people in the sciences as Christians. We need people in engineering as Christians. We need people who are in the medical field as Christians. We need people who are in the law field as Christians. And so what we don't have at this point is a good alternative in Christian education for those types of degrees. Now, I mean, we do have some alternatives. I'm not saying there's no alternatives. What I'm saying is that we don't have good alternatives all across the board. A situation where I have a biblical worldview that goes along with some of these degrees in every case. We don't. And so, but we need people in those areas. We need people that are doing those, that are have a Christian worldview, Bible centered and God centered worldview. So that's all I'm saying, is that at some point your kids are going to be exposed to those things, and yes, in the formative years, in terms of, especially as young as, as they, from the womb all the way till whatever point that is, you definitely need to be teaching them and giving them that foundation. And they need to always have that foundation, and they need to always have a family that's around them. You can't. The thing about it is that we can't minimize we certainly don't need to minimize the role of the mother and the father in the child's life, the role of a solid, God-fearing family that is going to make the Lord center of their lives. And I mean, we can't, and then also a Bible teaching church that comes alongside the family, which we talked about that in the last podcast, that you have to have all of that. And then if the child ends up having to go to a public school in order to get an education in, a STEM degree or law degree or whatever, they have all that foundation, and they have that. So when they get challenged in terms of their worldview, they can look at that professor and they can say, but this is what I believe, and this is why I believe it. And it's more than just a Bible story. It's more than just, it's something robust that they have a robust understanding of the world from a biblical worldview, and they can defend it. It's not just their parents' faith. It's not just, that it's not just a Bible story that they were told. It's something that's robust that they can actually defend their faith. I think we have to make sure that we're giving our children that. Whether it's children in the church, our responsibility as pastors is to provide the resources to help our families to get to where they need to be in order to teach their children, and it's the family responsibility to make sure that the children are being taught, given that foundation.
Will private or homeschool, will that be a guarantee of our child's salvation?
No. You ask the question, will private or homeschool guarantee a child's salvation? The answer is absolutely not. No more than going to Grace Bible Church is a guarantee of someone's salvation. Just because someone goes to a solid church, and I would like to think Grace Bible Church is a solid church, just because you go to a solid church doesn't make you a Christian. You could go to Grace Community Church in California with John MacArthur and still not be a Christian. You can go to Grace Jackson, great church, still not be a Christian. And especially children, I'll just be straight with you, that's one of the things that I hate to see, is when, these children get a pride about them that think that says, oh yeah, because I'm a part of this church, or because I went to this private school, or because I'm homeschooled, I'm better than everybody. And that makes me, gives me favor with God. That's actually no different than the Pharisees. That's Pharisaical. It has nothing to do with what school you went to. It has nothing to do with what, whether you were homeschooled or whether you were put in public school. It has nothing to do with your salvation. Has nothing to do with those things. It has to do with whether or not you have cried out to a holy God for His grace and for Him to show mercy towards you. And that you are a sinner, and you acknowledge that you're a sinner before a holy God. That is, Paul says, "For by grace you're saved through faith, that not of yourselves. It is the gift of God." And so that's how we're saved. It isn't where we went to school. It isn't what church we go to. It isn't any of that. It's by grace through faith.
And it kind of brings me to this question: is not all Christian schools are quote unquote Christian?
Yeah, and I mean, you need to be, and even choosing a Christian school, you need to be clear, what their perspective is. There are different perspectives in terms of Christian schools. Some Christian schools would be more evangelistic in their outreach or in their outlook, and so they would say, you just have to agree to our rules. You have to agree to be, a good citizen, so to speak, according to God's law, but we don't expect you to be a Christian. So you need to be aware, in terms of, what type of school, what their philosophy is in terms of that. Yeah, and for sure, just because a Christian school says that they're Christian doesn't necessarily make them Christian. There's a Christian school here in Gainesville that their whole thing is they're more of an outreach. They get funding to help people in disadvantaged areas, and I'm not against that. I mean, I truly, if I were going to teach in a Christian school, that would probably be something that would be appealing to me, because I can actually preach the gospel to children who need to hear it. I mean, everyone needs to hear it, but they don't believe they're Christians. They don't believe that they came from difficult situations, and so they're looking for hope. And so that I guess what I'm saying is not all Christian schools are made the same. Not all are good. Just because they're Christian schools doesn't mean that your child is going to be protected from all evil, because that's not the case. We found that out, in our situation. I'll never forget my pastor in California. We had some issues in a Christian school there, and my pastor in California said, "Yeah," he said, I think that what happened is you trusted people and you thought that it was going to be more Christian than it is." And I mean, I hate to see that. And he's right. He was right. And so that's what we have to recognize as we put our kids in a Christian environment, in a Christian school environment, is that there are different philosophies. The schools, not all of them are the same. It all comes down to, in a lot of ways, it comes down to the administration. And, if you have an administration that cares for your children and loves your children and wants to see them turn to the Lord and has a good, solid outlook in terms of education, then, count yourself blessed.
So we've touched on public schools, private schools. As we wrap this up, let's just look a little bit at homeschooling. And the big drawback you hear from homeschooling is, does homeschooling make a child socially awkward? Because, the homeschool, they're at home. They're not with other kids. Does it make them socially awkward?
I think there is an awkwardness about a child that's only exposed or mainly exposed to their family and people that are around them that are trustworthy, or the family feels is trustworthy. Yes, I think there is an awkwardness. Now the question is that a bad awkwardness? Is that bad? Is that a bad thing? And I don't necessarily think so, because I think that as they grow and as they become more mature and as they're exposed to different things as adults, they're going to adjust. I mean, we adjust, and I'm not the same person I was when I grew up. I mean, if I were the same person I was growing up, that would be bad. But just because a child has some awkwardness, in terms of who they are when they're in the ninth grade, who wasn't awkward in the ninth grade, who isn't awkward, at those stages for different reasons. And so I don't need to look at someone's awkwardness and say, well, that means that they're, messed up and they'll never be able to adjust. That doesn't mean that at all. Matter of fact, if I teach my children within the family structure, if I teach my children to be resilient and to be able to adjust to different situations, if I model that for my children, they're going to pick up on that. Were they awkward at times? Probably. But was that ultimately the determinative of their life? No. I mean, I don't think so.
I just can't help but feel how awkward the homeschool class reunion must be. I mean, that's got to be awkward. But at least you don't need a name tag. It's kind of an odd.
Yeah, the homeschool class reunion.
It's kind of lonely. So, as a dad and who's had kids, and now we're living in 2023, what is the best way to go? Public, private, home?
Well, in 2023, boy, and I'm, Lord willing, I'm going to have to help my kids make these decisions, help guide them in these decisions. I can say that it seems to me in the United States in 2023, it may be the most difficult time in the history of the world to bring up children. I can't say that for sure, but boy, it seems like it, at least from my perspective. There is so many things out there, so much evil at their fingertips. You've got the phones that are there, you've got television, you've got and just so many influences, negative influences in their lives, more than it seems like than ever. Um, and so I think that I certainly don't envy young families who are trying to figure it out and get it right. Um, I would to answer your specific question in terms of what the best way to go is. I don't know that there is a one size fits all answer. I would definitely, if I were in a position of starting over right now, it would be a combination. I would start with homeschooling, and I wouldn't, the whole kindergarten starts at 4 or 5 years old. I would start I would start doing some sort of education very, very early. Certainly would be a biblical focus in terms of teaching them doctrine. I would definitely be training them going back to last week, I'd definitely be training my children to be able to sit through church. I would be I would be training them in the home. I would be training them early to read. I'd be training them early to begin to do math and things like that. I would transition into a more formal homeschool environment as they get older, probably 3, 4, or 5. I would definitely be homeschooling in some fashion, for the first several years. At some point, if I got to the point where I felt like that I couldn't take them any further personally in terms of their education, whether that would be my wife or myself, I would potentially put them in private school. But I think that we have to understand that those things are expensive and not every Christian can afford it. And so, I think that co-ops are a good answer to that. I would love to see Grace Bible Church have a co-op or be involved in a co-op. I would love to see us have be moving in the direction of that, but that's of the Lord and what He want for us. But I think that co-ops are a good answer to the issue of not being. I think co-ops are a good answer to the homeschool versus private school realm. I think the hard part is, and I've brought it up on a couple of different occasions or a couple of different times in this podcast. I think the hard part is that we get to a point where things like the medical field, things like law, things like engineering, specifically STEM type degrees, is going to be very difficult for them to get, in a Christian environment. It's not impossible. I mean, I know there's schools out there that are doing those things, but to be an accredited engineering school is very difficult to obtain for something other than a public or a large private university. And so when you get into those things, it's difficult. And so I think it's going to be hard for Christians to completely exit those realms, because if we do completely exit those realms, we're not going to be in those realms. And I think that's a wrong-headed view of things if we do that, if we pull ourselves out of those things. So, boy, I just don't, like I say, I don't have a prescription that says this is the perfect way. But I will say that whatever you do, you can't it's no different than the church. The parents can't just turn the education completely over to the school, no more than they should turn their training of their children completely over to the church. The idea should be that they are completely involved in that, and that they know what's being taught, and that they're helping guide what's being taught. And anything that is anti-God, biblical worldview, that they're helping offset that at home, and because they're aware of it and they're discussing it.
Okay, so there's not one size fits all. It's be engaged, be discerning, and sometimes you just have to say, okay, I can't afford this to send them to private school. We're going to send them to a public school, and be in prayer and be alert.
Yes. Now Now, having said that, I don't think it needs to be a cop. I don't think it needs to be a cop out that I can't afford it. I mean, I do think that it's going to be when you have children, it's going to be a sacrifice.
Mm.
You know, you may have to give up the good life. You know, you may not. I mean, so many people want to have both. They want to have the large house and the nice cars and the big boat and all the stuff, the trappings of American life. And, you know, but then they say, well, I don't have enough money to send my kids to private school. Some people have all that and they have enough money to send their kids to private school, and they go into debt, you know, and so that isn't the right answer either. The right answer really is, you know, make the sacrifices you need to make. Mm-hmm. And I can tell you, it really comes down to Deuteronomy 6. As you go, as you're doing life, you know, you're teaching your children, and it really comes down to talking to your children and understanding where they're at and asking them questions mm-hmm. and guiding them. And you know, they love you. I mean, they have children have this default to love their parents. I mean, and so, you know, obviously as they get older, there's things that happen, and, you know, there's hormones that get involved as teenagers, things like that. But they ultimately love their parents. I mean, that's what we've found with our children, is that, look, they have this setting that just says, I love my mom and dad. And, you know, we should take advantage of that by actually doing things that get involved and show them that we love them, and we care for them, and we care what they end up doing, and we care ultimately for their salvation. And, you know, make sure that we're being parents that are involved. And really, if we do that, then all of these questions, you know, that we're having about parenting and how to do Christian school or not, or public school or homeschool and Christian children's ministry and all that gets answered because, you know, ultimately our parents are involved in loving them and teaching them.
Well, we hope this was informative. As we wrap this up, getting back to your school days, when you see a ping pong paddle, do you still have trauma?
Well, it actually, most of them were made out of 1x4s with holes in them.
It's kind of ironic that Grace Bible Church has two pastors that were actually spanked in school.
Yeah, but it sounds like I was spanked on a...
You were spanked more.
I was spanked a lot more.
Is that where you got the nickname, Spanky? You've been listening to Fresh Bread, a podcast ministry of Grace Bible Church Gainesville. For more information, go to gracegainesville.org. And thanks for listening.